Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Blessed Man Meditations is where we provide answers to the intellectual side of Christianity and equip Christians to provide an answer for the hope that is in them. Today on Blessed Man Meditations, we continue our look at Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. Metaxas is a best-selling author whose books have been translated into 25 different languages. He hosts a nationally syndicated radio show and the acclaimed conversation series Socrates in the City. Metaxas is a prominent cultural commentator whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the Wall Street Journal. He's written a pretty well-known article about how science has increasingly made the case for God. Today, on Blessed Man Meditations, we continue looking into his book, and we're going through chapter 12. We're talking about the discovery of the New Testament manuscripts. Metaxas begins by saying that during much of the 19th and 20th centuries, many academics claimed that Jesus never existed, and that most of the people, places, and events of the New Testament were made up. But evidence has come in to refute that erroneous claim, and such dismissiveness now seems inconceivable. Nonetheless, during the decades in which such skeptical winds blew, such now absurd notions blazed through enough to blind millions to the truth. And that blinding continues to go on today. Many people refuse to believe that God would exist, even despite the evidence that is available. Many people refuse to believe that Jesus existed and arose from the dead, despite the evidence that's available. Several lamentable theories regarding the resurrection were floated. Many of these were discussed in the series that I did going through the evidence from the new evidence that demands a verdict by Josh McDowell. Some of this includes the swoon theory, in which it's claimed that Jesus never died but only fainted. And most of the alternative theories found some cultural purchase. Of course, serious historians always knew Josephus and Tacitus, and others had referred to Jesus' existence and Jesus' crucifixion. There are multiple sources outside the Bible that point to Jesus' existence. And except for those bearing a stubborn animus to the historicity of the New Testament, few would ignore such trustworthy sources as Josephus and Tacitus and the others that are available. But such hostility exists still, because there are plenty who refuse to believe it. There are those in the academy who, even today, at the most, even with the most well-established facts, people still refuse to believe it. And of course, we discussed some of those well-established facts when going through. Don't have enough faith to be an atheist on the chapter for the evidence for the resurrection in that book by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek. For example, Josephus twice refers to Jesus in his History of the Jews, written in the last years of the first century. The Roman senator and historian Tacitus in his Annals writes of Jesus and Jesus' crucifixion, and in a letter to the Emperor Trajan, the Roman historian Suetonius, who was also the governor of Bithynia and Pontus, discusses what to do with the troublemaking Christians who refused to worship the emperor. This is some of the extra-biblical evidence I just referred to. Although all those long-known sources are unimpeachable, people can't argue about those sources. Around the aforementioned 1966 Time magazine cover story, it was still culturally acceptable to pretend that the historicity of Jesus was an open question. But it really is not an open question. In fact, even most skeptics will agree to the historicity of Jesus, that he was an actual person. They just disagree with his claims. Since most cultural elites were secular, they were not eager to counter these unfounded ideas, and skepticism toward Jesus and the Christian faith reached something of a high water mark in the West around that time, around the time that the Time magazine article came out. But in keeping with the thesis of Metaxas' book, Is Atheism Dead?, since that movement of maximum skepticism The tide has been flowing almost exclusively in the other direction, pointing out the veracity of theism, specifically Christian theism and the evidence for Christianity. So this chapter, we're going to discuss the New Testament documents, the New Testament manuscripts. Perhaps the most powerful argument for the historicity of the New Testament is made in the New Testament documents. Are they reliable? A book written by the Scottish New Testament scholar F. Bruce. In Josh McDowell's New Evidence That Demands a Verdict, there are a lot of references to F. Bruce and his scholarly work on the evidence for the documents of the Bible. In Bruce's slim book, The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? Bruce makes the overwhelming case that not only are the documents of the New Testament historically reliable, but they're the most historically reliable in the history of all ancient documents with no close competitors. There are no other ancient documents that are as reliable as the New Testament documents, Bruce claims. No ancient documents begin to approach the New Testament manuscripts from a historical perspective. This is because there are two basic criteria by which historians judge a manuscript. First is the chronological distance between the manuscript in hand and the original manuscript from which it was copied. How much time elapsed from when the original was created to when the first copy was created? That's the question. The second criteria is the number of manuscript copies, which is how we verify the consistency of what's been written and how we can know that it's not a one-off forgery. How many copies are there of the originals? That's the other question. As we mentioned in our discussion of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the writings of Julius Caesar were composed in the 1st century BC, and the earliest copies are from approximately 900 AD, so a full millennium yawns between the original and the manuscript copies of Julius Caesar that we have, and there are 10 copies of that. We only have 7 copies of Plato's works, composed about 400 BC, and these copies also date from around 900 AD, so we have a gap of 12 centuries between the originals and the existing copies of Plato's works. Yet outside the New Testament, there are the copies of Plato's works are some of the very best attested documents. Outside the New Testament, the Plato works are some of the best attested documents. The Greek dramatists Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes, and the great orator Demosthenes, as well as the philosopher Aristotle and historians Thucydides and Herodotus, all have gaps between 1,200 and 1,500 years between the originals and the most recent copies. But nobody questions the veracity of these documents. Nobody questions the reliability of these documents. And the number of manuscripts of their works is decidedly modest. We don't have nearly as many copies of these works as we do of the New Testament. And we have eight from Thucydides and Herodotus, and no more than 5 of any one work from Aristotle. Still, no serious historian would quibble about the historical reliability of the documents that we have for Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, Demosthenes, Aristotle, Thucydides, Herodotus. Nobody would quibble about their reliability. The great distances between the originals and the extant manuscripts are typical and thought to be quite trustworthy enough, even with so few copies. But the New Testament documents, composed in the latter half of the 1st century, offer an unprecedented and enviable level of reliability. Approximately 5,000 Greek manuscripts containing all or part of the New Testament exist. Let me say that again. Approximately 5,000 Greek manuscripts containing all or part of the New Testament exist. But we're going to question the validity and veracity of those documents. Yet we don't question the validity and veracity of the ones we just mentioned on the previous slide. There are 8, philosopher and theologian J.P. Moreland sums it up, quote, approximately 5,000 Greek manuscripts containing all or part of the New Testament exist. There are 8,000 manuscript copies of the Latin Vulgate, which is the Latin translation of the Bible done by Jerome, and more than 350 copies of the Syriac versions of the New Testament. And these originated from 150 to 280. Most copies are from the 400s, just a couple centuries after the events. Besides this, virtually the entire New Testament could be reproduced from citations contained in the works of the early church fathers. I believe it's Cold Case Christianity, J. Warner Wallace. That's one of his big talking points, is that Most of the New Testament can be reproduced from early church fathers or documents, not including the New Testament manuscripts. There are some 32,000 citations in the writings of the fathers prior to the Council of Nicaea, which took place in AD 325. As we can see, the number of manuscript copies is beyond compare. When we consider how many centuries exist between the originals and the earliest manuscripts, we're equally astonished. Although there's a great range of the dates and dates of the copies, all the way from early in the 2nd century up to the Reformation, the existence of many at the earlier end of that range is mind-boggling, as is the idea that some are from less than 1 or 2 centuries after they were originally composed. Moreland continues. Many of the manuscripts are early. For example, the John Ryland manuscript from about 120 AD. It was found in Egypt and contains a few verses from John's Gospel. The Chester Beatty Papyri from 200 AD contains major portions of the New Testament. The Codex Sinaiticus from AD 350 contains virtually all the New Testament, and the Codex Vaticanus from AD 325 to 350 contains almost the entire Bible. Some of these are so close to the originals that, compared with other manuscripts from antiquity, it is almost as though we actually did have the originals. John Ryland manuscript mentioned by Moreland is the most amazing of all, dating from perhaps only 30 years after the Apostle John's death. This is the disciple who famously lay at the breast of Jesus at the Last Supper and is a principal figure in all of the Gospel accounts. The existence of something so close as almost to be touching the originals or from a figure directly involved in almost all that took place is a singularly tantalizing example of historical reliability. So, one of the things that points to the strong historical reliability of the New Testament is the fact that the John Ryland manuscript contains the Gospel of John, which in the manuscript dates to be 30 years after John's death. The Ryland Papyrus was discovered by Bernard Pine Grenfell, an Oxford papyrologist, who in 1896 began excavation of the spectacular trove of papyrus in the Egyptian city of Oxyrhynchus. There's Grenfell, and there's a fragment of his manuscript. That discovery site was a dump where people had been tossing things for centuries, and the ancient manuscripts discovered at that dump proved to be something from a fevered dream. For example, a lost play from Sophocles was found, along with previously unknown poetry from Sappho. What eclipsed these other things instantly and forever was the discovery of a credit card-sized fragment of what was eventually identified as part of the Gospel of John, which was dated between 100 AD and 175 AD, and that must be what's in the picture below. The idea that this manuscript of New Testament scriptures from what might have been a single decade after it was composed, or 80 years at the most after it was composed, marked an almost unthinkable proximity to the authors and figures involved. The manuscript dated so close to when the events actually happened that it's hard not to take it seriously. Just as the Dead Sea Scrolls did for the Old Testament, this fragment undergirded the validity of all later copies and instantly pushed back the reliability of these documents by several centuries. And of course, because of what they found at Oxyrhynchus, scholars have ever since been wondering what yet remains to be discovered. If a fragment of John's Gospel written nearly during the lifetime of John himself had been found and was somehow preserved for 1800 years, surely there's more to find. But what? Now we're going to argue from quirkiness. Before we move on to other archaeological evidence for the New Testament, we turn briefly to what scholars call the internal evidence for the truth of the accounts in these manuscripts. For those whose objection is that the Bible was written by people with an agenda and who were molding a narrative to suit their purposes, there are endless examples clearly arguing against that erroneous idea. The kinds of evidence vary, but to anyone sensitive to literature and to how things are communicated in different genres, there are plenty of instances in the long career of the Bible that have what is called the ring of truth, however subjective that concept might be. One from the New Testament, as recorded near the end of John's Gospel, concerns the number of fish caught after Jesus tells the fatigued disciples to throw their nets back into the water. Something similar happened at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, as recorded in the 5th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. In that earlier instance, it was obviously morning, since the disciples were finished fishing and were cleaning their nets. Jesus, wanting to speak to the large crowd gathered, chose to step onto one of the boats and push out a bit from the shore. We may assume that the shore was curved, and this would have improved his ability to communicate, or perhaps the extraordinary stillness of the water at that early hour helped him protect his voice. Many of us have heard people in a boat talking out in the lake, oblivious that their voices would carry so far that we could hear them. The passage says, when he stopped speaking, Jesus said to Simon, launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch. But Simon answered and said to him, Master, we've toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net. And when they had done this, in verse 6, they caught a great number of fish, and their net was breaking. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both the boats so that they began to sink. When Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, Depart from me, I am a sinful man, O Lord. For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish which they'd taken. And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, Don't be afraid, for from now on you will catch men. So when they had brought their boats to the land, they forsook all and followed him. Strong evidence of Jesus' resurrection. The initial exasperation of Simon being told by a non-fisherman to put his net in the water at an hour when fish were known to be scarce, which is the point of them fishing at night, is obvious. But when Peter obeys Jesus, not only does he catch fish, but he also catches so many he knows that it is a miracle, and responds by kneeling before Jesus in profound awe of what has occurred. So it's curious that roughly 3 years later, something similar happens. By now, these disciples have seen innumerable miracles, many far more impressive and dramatic, and have perhaps forgotten about this miracle at the beginning of their time with Jesus, which must seem ages before, considering all that's transpired. But now, after his crucifixion and resurrection, the disciples are back doing what they've always done, what they know best, because they think that this, since he didn't meet their expectations and didn't inaugurate the kingdom right away, that maybe they think it wasn't true because they've forgotten about his prediction of his resurrection because they were dejected at his death. Yet they're having no luck, having fished all night, as was their custom. And then, in the morning, as they prepare to end their efforts, a stranger on the shore has the temerity to instruct them to cast their net on the right side of the boat, confidently saying that they'll find some fish. How would he know? But with nothing to lose, they do what he suggests, and sure enough, their nets are instantly so filled with fish that they are flabbergasted. It's then that Peter seems to realize this is precisely what happened 3 years earlier when Jesus told him to put the net in the water, and instantly John knows who the stranger on the shore is and blurts out, It's the Lord. Of course it is. For a miracle of that magnitude to be done so effortlessly, John had to know it was the Lord. It seems though Jesus had slyly played a joke on Peter, knowing that with the vast number of fish he would suddenly understand what just happened. So, in an explosion, Peter forgets about the fish and dives into the water, frantically swims for Jesus, whom he'd missed so terribly and fervently, and whom we soon remember he betrayed 3 times on the eve of his crucifixion. He loved him so much, he felt so bad about betraying him that he went out and wept bitterly after he betrayed him, and Lord mercifully and graciously gave him an opportunity to restore himself by asking him 3 times if he loved him, to equal the number of times that he denied him. But before Jesus deals with Peter's failing by forgiving and restoring him, like I just alluded to, he says something more practical. He says, Bring some of the fish. So Peter goes back to the boat, hauls in the net, and then we read something odd and striking. It says that the number of fish was 153. What could be quirkier? Why does the Bible record that number? Could there be any reason for saying that there were 153 fish other than that there were actually 153 fish? Certainly doesn't seem like a symbolic number, like 144 would be, nor can we say it's a rough figure since it is so extremely specific. Many have tried to ferret out some hidden meaning, but if you have to try very hard to figure out the meaning of something, this may be a clue that there is no hidden meaning in the number 153. Paraphrasing Freud, sometimes a number is just a number, and in this case, Metaxas says the number 153 is just to be interpreted as being the number of fish caught, 153. but there are innumerable cases in the Bible of such curious details in which the rather clear meaning is simply that something happened, that someone recorded something that happened, and that it does not fit the larger narrative in any especially meaningful, poetic, or symbolic way. It is merely an indicator that those recording the events did so. All writing is editing to some extent, since writers usually leave out things they might have included and tell things in a certain order. But every now and then, in reading the scriptures, we see examples of lumpiness and quirkiness, of things that do nothing more than to point to simple facts and veracity of what we're reading. If the number of fish had been 100 or 150, we would have assumed that the number was rounded, because what are the odds that the number would be exactly either 100 or 150? The odds are very low that it would be such a round number. The fact that it is such a precise number, 153, insinuates authenticity. But 153, what can it mean but that there were precisely that many? If there is any meaning at all, it is probably just that anyone familiar with normal fishing patterns in that area would have been stunned and impressed by the extensive volume of fish. They would have known what an unprecedented and stupefying number of fish it was. And that is all. Such an odd specific fact inevitably bolsters the validity of the rest of the story. A similar example is found in what took place that Thursday night in the Garden of Gethsemane, when the Roman soldiers and Jerusalem temple guards arrive to arrest Jesus. The tension during this confrontation is extraordinary. It is after midnight, and as these men lay hands on Jesus to arrest him, the ever impetuous Peter erupts into action, coming down with a sword on the head of the high priest's servant, cutting off the man's ear. In fact, some speculate that cut off his ear because he missed his head. The text is so straightforward and simple that we may forget that there was probably an explosion of screaming and gushing of blood, and then the visceral response of the soldiers with their spears and clubs, who easily might have responded in kind, killing Peter instantly along with the rest of those present. But here, the verse is as dull and minimalist as if Ernest Hemingway had written it. It says that Jesus stepped forward and miraculously healed the man's ear, and that all of his followers fled instantly. We aren't so surprised that they fled, for they had no idea what was happening, and they knew they might be treated extremely harshly for following the man being arrested. But not all of them fled. As the soldiers led Jesus away, the scriptures say, "And there followed him a certain young man having a linen cloth cast about his naked body." We have no idea why there was someone there wearing only a linen cloth or a sheet. No one has in 2,000 years been able to make any real sense of it. The scriptures say the soldiers laid hold of him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. What could be stranger? An anonymous young man is in the Garden of Gethsemane after midnight, wearing no clothes, inexplicably wrapped in a linen cloth, and he alone remains behind when all those closest to Jesus have fled. Why don't the scriptures explain this? What can be the meaning? Or perhaps there is none, as we think of meaning. I believe some have speculated that it is Mark himself, since it occurs in Mark's Gospel. Perhaps the blank simplicity of the text attests to the fact that this is merely what happened and no one knows why, nor felt the freedom to embellish the account with possible interpretations. One of the things that Frank Turek and Norm Geisler say in their book is that the gospel writers include embarrassing details. This would be an example of one of those embarrassing details. This would be something that they wouldn't make up and embellish because it doesn't make them look good. To leave it in there does not cast them in a positive light. But perhaps in the interest of verisimilitude, they felt the need to retain it. In any event, here's another peculiar detail that defies easy explanation, but that in its own presence of nakedness argues for the simple genuineness of the narrative. There are other details in the scriptures that seem not merely to make no particular sense or have any reason to be there, but that even seem to undermine the writer's narrative of the events so that we might expect them to have edited them out. There are things that, like I just said, that make the authors look bad. That where Jesus points out their dullness, their slowness to grasp what he's telling them. And so these don't cast them in a positive light, yet they're there. For example, the scriptures say that on Easter morning, several women went to the tomb to finish preparing Jesus' body for burial. And yes, women were not held in high esteem in that ancient Near Eastern society, ancient Israel society. The testimony of women was not typically trusted. It was typically the testimony of men that was trusted. That's one of the other things that Josh McDowell in the New Evidence that Demands a Verdict, I believe, points out the veracity of the New Testament account. That one of the other embarrassing details is that women were the first to the tomb. Because the sun was setting that Friday after the body had been taken down from the cross and brought to the tomb, they could not finish what they begun. It was an impermissible thing to do on the Sabbath, which began at sundown. So they stopped and went home and had to wait all Saturday until the very first opportunity after sunrise on Sunday. They returned to the tomb to complete their work of anointing Jesus' body for burial. They knew they'd need to find someone to move the giant stone that was rolled in front of the tomb's entrance. But when they arrived, the tomb was already open and it was empty. An angel told them that Jesus had risen. Of course, the women were undone by this news that Jesus had risen. They were trembling, they were stunned, and they ran back to tell the disciples what they had discovered, that he was not there, that he had risen. But if anyone had concocted this narrative and made up the story, the last thing they would have done would be to make a group of women the first witnesses at the tomb to what is the most important event in the entire New Testament, or one could even say the most important event in all of human history. In the patriarchal atmosphere of that time, women were not regarded with much credibility. So why would the writers of these Gospels make them the ones to see the angel and the stone rolled away? Because it was true. They wanted to include the embarrassing detail of the women discovering the tomb because that would lend more credibility to the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. Anyone wanting to construct a credible narrative would not have told this detail. It's less likely that they would make it up. It reinforces the fact that they're telling the truth, that they're not embellishing the details. This leaves us with the idea that they told the story the way it was because they could not lie about something so important, even if it worked against all credibility at all, but they were stuck. And whom they believed demanded that they not lie and that they trust him with the results. What else can explain such a striking detail on which nearly everything hinges, at the center of this most difficult part of the whole story? There are innumerable similarly strange details in the Old Testament too, which seem to contribute nothing to the story other than to add additional detail and therefore to argue for bare veracity. In 2 Samuel, we read the awful story in which King David's son Amnon rapes his own half-sister Tamar. Tamar's brother Absalom is furious at hearing about this rape and orders men to kill Amnon. But in chapter 13, verse 30 of 2 Samuel, in the narrative, it says that a report reached David that all of his sons had been killed, not just Amnon. 2 verses later, David's nephew Jonadab arrives and says, "No, not all your sons have been killed. It was only Amnon." If one were telling an invented story, why include this bizarre misunderstanding that's cleared up almost immediately and has no bearing on the larger story? Isn't that sort of detail the very mark of nonfiction? The embarrassing detail, the it seems to be in the story for no other reason than it happened. Now we're going to talk beyond the manuscripts. Although the evidence for Jesus of Nazareth and many of the people, places, things of the New Testament has grown over time, the level of specificity and detail that has emerged over the last few decades has increased, sometimes to a level that almost seems impossible, as though specifically intended to twit the dour skeptics. We discuss two of the most astounding and very recent examples, both of which concern the life of Jesus himself. The first is the extremely recent discovery of Jesus' childhood home in Nazareth, which is as astonishing as anything we could hope to find. The second is the recent discovery of the actual stone pavement mentioned in the New Testament as Gabbatha, upon which Jesus stood bleeding with his crown of thorns during the trial before Pilate. Not only this, but of the very bema seat on which Pilate sat during his trial. Did anyone ever dream such things still existed, much less that we might discover them in recent years? As with the aforementioned identification of biblical Sodom and other amazing finds, the oddest part of the story is sometimes that such discoveries are not immediately trumpeted to the world, and we will touch on that too. That is the end of chapter 12 of Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. Next time we will discuss chapter 13, where we will discover more New Testament archaeology. So thank you for tuning in. Please like, comment, and subscribe. and I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.